One of the tools that we've been building up and using from a machine learning standpoint is a set of tools called LunchBoxML. LunchBoxML is included within the overall LunchBox package. We released LunchBoxML as an open source component to LunchBox. So there's portions of LunchBox that are open source and other portions that aren't. We made the distinction between LunchBox and LunchBoxML just because I thought it was kind of a neat way to have just sort of an extended project that kind of offers something unique to what is otherwise a collection of useful workflows and utilities. So LunchBox was started maybe 8 years ago. I think was when the first published version of LunchBox was put out there by myself on the kind of original Proving Ground blog. And the motivator behind LunchBox was to capture a series of tools that I didn't want to create anymore and publish it as like something that could be reusable and readily adopted by others. So it was a way to save myself time at the end of the day. I was tired of finding an Excel tool that would let me push data to Excel. I was tired of making the same paneling tool over and over again for all the different competitions I was a part of. So it's like, oh, well, if I just kind of encode these into a single plugin, I can use it and others can use it as well. And LunchBoxML is then an open source extension onto LunchBox and was produced 2 summers ago as a part of research. Nazanin was the primary author of a lot of these. It was thinking about a summer project. She was really interested in getting into C# and learning how to code. I would personally, and the rest of the group was also interested in like uses of machine learning. So we're like, oh, what if the project became kind of building up a series of Grasshopper nodes that exposed different portions of machine learning algorithms, and then we'll publish it open source and include it as part of LunchBox. So LunchBoxML is an fully open source extension. There is a Dynamo version and a Grasshopper version. We focused more on the Grasshopper version. That's just typically what we use more than anything else. We haven't really done much with the Dynamo version as of late. And a lot of that just has to do with kind of the nature of our own workflow. But we have put out a Dynamo version that folks are more than welcome to extend and build upon as well. What the LunchBoxML Toolkit is a set of Grasshopper components that expose functions and portions of this .NET framework. This is a library called Accord. The Accord framework is kind of a .NET API that exposes various machine learning algorithms, from classification to regression testing, the Bayesian algorithm that I showed for kind of evaluating different data sets in the presentation are included here. There's also like computer vision algorithms as well, which are pretty cool. And there's all sorts of like examples on this site. So for example, here's a multilinear regression class that shows all the methods, and then there's even an example of how this is implemented in code. So we said, okay, well, what if we took portions of Accord and expose them as components inside of Grasshopper? So inside of Rhino, if you launch Grasshopper with the LunchBox tool installed, you'll see as a component, a set of components, some machine learning tools. So in the LunchBox tab, you'll see that there are a series of machine learning based tools. Linear regression, there's a set of regression nodes which we'll talk about. These are really straightforward to implement. These Gaussian mixture and Kmeans clustering are also quite straightforward to implement. The idea is that we wanted to make these really accessible to people that might be just trying machine learning for the first time, and also just accessible to us. Like, we appreciate a good simple node that we can quickly deploy as well. And then if folks want to extend these tools, then you can get into the code and build your own. What I'll start out with is an example of regression, and there are some examples of this in our data set. If you go to your desktop and find LunchBoxML, there's a series of tools here that are pre-made and kind of articulate how these things can work. Is this it's nonlinear regression? Point cloud. Yeah, that's fine. We'll use this one. This one's actually pretty good. Really straightforward graph. You can see that the graph is describing a set of sample points. They're plotted in XY. We're ignoring Z. It's just an XY plot. These are then being passed into the inputs and the output of the solver here. And then there is a test value that's being generated. And what we're able to do is say, okay, well, given this collection of points, you can see that there's the sample set of points is it's you can kind of intuit that it's kind of just flowing in this manner, right? It's kind of arcing up. What we're doing is we're calibrating the nonlinear solver to find a fit curve through those points, and it's essentially training the solver to discover this. And you can impact the output of this by changing the complexity and the degree of the solver. So if I reduce this degree, it's going to find what we would call an overfit curve, right? This may not be the best model for describing the overall trend line because it's really getting into these crevices and valleys and peaks and things like that. And so it kind of, and this one going here may be too simple, right, to describe some of the nuance. So you as the analyst may say like, okay, well, using my own intuition, I'm going to calibrate the algorithm to find a fit curve that seems to work the best. So it's sort of solving a geometry problem, and then it's reconstructing the curve over here. So let's get into recreating this. I'm going to go to a new document. And what I'm going to do is simply plot a series of points in space. I'm just going to grab my point tool and click around. And this may be representative of some data set that you've gathered. It's like you're kind of plotting an XY graph. It's it's about as basic as it comes. Increase some points over here. So we now have something that you can kind of discern as a person that there's a pattern there. I mean, I don't know if when you took like math class in middle school, sometimes like one of the I think there are a couple of at least I remember having a couple of segments where it's like, yeah, you're kind of given some data and you have to draw a fit curve. It's kind of essentially what we're reproducing here. So I'm going to reference those points in. So we now have those points referenced into Grasshopper. And then I'm going to go to LunchBox and I'm going to find my nonlinear regression tool. Pull that out. So in inspecting these inputs, you can see that there's a test case. So this is the data I want to test and get some kind of result from. Inputs and outputs refer to the training data. So I want to give it an input and train it for an expected output. And so what I can do here is say like, okay, I'm going to feed it maybe the X value as my input, and my y value is going to be the output. So for every value of x I feed in, this thing is then going to predict the y. And then we have a couple of controls here that allow us to calibrate the nonlinear regression function. So first thing I need to do is to establish my inputs and output. So this is my collection of points. What I'm going to do is go in and decompose those points into x, y, and z values. So if I go to my vector set here, I can find the deconstruct point, pass my points in, and then we're getting a collection of x values and a collection of y values. And so what I would say is, okay, I'm going to train this on inputs x, and I'm also going to train this on an output y. Now, this isn't quite going to work going straight in like this because your inputs might have multiple dimensions to them. It may be that you want to do x and y and then predict z, for example, as a nonlinear function. So there is an important thing that we need to do here, and that's graft the output x. So it's going to kind of graph those points, and so what we can see is when we inspect this data structure, it's not going to be so apparent here. It's like, but you have these are all your x values organized in their own tree branch, and these are a flat list of single outputs. But you might have other characteristics and criteria here. So for this first data point, for this first endpoint, you could have a list of 10 things, right? That helps to predict the output or something like that. So next we need to create a test. So if an example of this might say like, okay, well, what is, so if I were to test maybe a point right here, like let's say this is I'll actually make this along the x-axis to kind of illustrate this, right? We have a clustering of points, but what if I'm interested in a value like right in through here, right? There is no point that corresponds to this, right? And so we need to use the algorithm to make a prediction on what the y value is at that location. So what I can do here is say, okay, well, I'm going to reference this point in like so, and I'm also going to deconstruct this like so. So we're now giving an x value, and I'm going to test it. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, okay, well, you've supplied in x. The result is going to be my resultant y, like so, right? And so now it's saying, okay, well, for this value of x, if I click on this at 21.189428, we have a predicted y value of 16.534, right? And so what I can do is then illustrate what that point looks like by reconstructing that point and saying, okay, well, this is going to be x as my input, this is going to be y. And the algorithm is sort of determining that, okay, well, this is where we think that point is going to be. And if I move this down the road, down this x-axis, you can actually start to see that that point is attempting to illustrate something, right? And what that illustration is ultimately going to be is a prediction curve. So for what we can do then is say, okay, well, we're now testing one data point. What happens if we test a series of points along this x-axis? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a set of numerical values. I'm going to use the series component. And the series component out of the box is generating a list of numbers starting at 0, moving in steps of 1, and a count of 10 to serve as our test data. And this also needs to be grafted. It's kind of, everything's kind of getting jumbled up right in through there. So what I'm going to do is set my integer value, because this is the count. I'm going to do something like 50, which is giving me something that's like this. And if I then pass through my curve, do the fit curve like so, it's giving me something that's pretty crazy. It's kind of all over the map. It's clearly not a refined curve by any means. And this is where some of these tools down here for calibrating the fit curve can become really useful. So what I'm going to do is jump over here, and we're going to adjust our constraints of this curve. Let's see. And if by kind of calibrating this even further, maybe do something like 10, we can start to get some kind of predictive curve that attempts to kind of reconcile or rationalize this overall collection of points. And I can continue to extend this if I would like to. So I'm going to increase. Right now this count is what, at 50? Yeah, I'll take this to 200 as my count. And then it becomes really hard to predict out here, right? Because it's like there's really no data, so it's gonna try to like figure out some kind of trajectory. I think it eventually just kind of flattens out, right, when it gets beyond, too far beyond the constraints. So you kind of have to know where your constraints are. Yeah, the calibrating allows us to overfit, underfit. Like so. So regression is a really simple way to kind of get into this sort of idea of using machine learning for some form of predictive modeling like this. We have an example of one that's used to not just describe a curve plot, but also like a surface plot in space. So if I go to 3D here, this is using a very similar setup. You see these points in space here. These are the sort of input data points. And what I'm saying is, okay, here are the sample points. I need to decompose them into inputs. In this case, the inputs are going to be x and y values. They're just randomly cast points. So you have random x and y and randomized z. X and y are being set out as the inputs. And then the output is the z value. And so what I do with the test points here is I'm feeding in x and y, like a regular set of x and y values, and it's predicting z. And so what it ends up doing is creating a definition of a surface that passes through each of those points. No real practical use for this particular algorithm outside of showing that, hey, you can generate some really cool 3D shapes. There are a couple of like hypothetical scenarios we have seen, like for example, like complex roof structures that are kind of driven by perhaps certain like key locations of certain elements, and perhaps there's like some use of an algorithm like this for predicting kind of an interpolated surface or something along those lines. But another kind of cool thing here is, of course, like messing with the fit curve. And I think more than anything, this example is a good one for showing how your inputs, in this case, let's see why we grafted it. You have basically two values to then drive the output of one. So there's a bit of list matching that's occurring here. And this, you can continue to extend, that list instead of attributes. The other example I wanted to show was using the Gaussian and K-means component to help develop, you know, uh, a grouping of panels on a complex surface that I illustrated before in the presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a new document. I'll just delete these out of my file here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sculpt this surface. Nothing too terribly fancy, but it'll have some complexity to it. And sometimes I just like to start off with a rectangle. I'm going to do a little rebuild here. And I'm just going to kind of modify these control points. Nothing too scientific with what I'm doing, right? Maybe I'll even do a little bit of a squeeze operation. Bring those in there for some other variability. So we have like a little surface to start with. Sometimes I feel like Bob Ross when I'm doing these types of things. I'm like, oh, it's a happy tree to complement the happy terrain. I've also pondered the idea of doing a workshop with a squirrel in my pocket as I do my painting, It's like, do my modeling. Good. So I'm going to reference this in. Let's see, surface. I could do a B-rep. I'll just do surface here. There we go. So we have that referenced. And what I'm going to do is then say, okay, I want to panelize the surface in some way. Like, let's say I want to fabricate this as a set of panelized elements. So I have a quick and dirty way of doing that with the LunchBox tools. I'm going to use just the quad panels component. I can say like, boom, there's my input. And you can see just out of the gate, hide some of this stuff. You can see we have a collection of panels. And I'll just kind of create some controls here for modifying our U and V division. Like so the component I'll be talking about, there's two components that do almost the same thing. There are some very subtle variations in how these algorithms work. There's what's called a Gaussian mixture, and then there's what's called a Kmeans clustering. The icons attempt to distinguish these in some way. But if I go back to that presentation I showed, let's see if I have that diagram. Okay. Uh-oh. Well, that locked up. We'll skip that. I'll be editing that out. I'll just illustrate it here. What do we have? Did it come back? It did come back. Okay, good. But yeah, whatever. I'll illustrate it here anyway. It's probably more effective. So it's a difference in behavior of how these things. So if I've got a collection of points that's like this, and I want to say, okay, well, given these points, I want to create three groups. As a human, I can look at this and be like, okay, well, this is like a group. That seems like it's a group. This is a group. This one's nebulous, in terms of is it a part of this group or the other group, so it has to make a decision. This group here, this point's a little bit nebulous. A Kmeans clustering will use like spherical or circular calculation methods to say like, okay, I'm going to group that. Maybe I'm going to group that, and I'm going to group that. Those are the regions it might describe. So it's going to use that as kind of its underlying search or clustering method. The Gaussian will use elliptical search. So if oops, there we go. Good. So it might do something like this. So it's a difference in just the underlying computational assumptions, which depending on what your use case is, you may want to select one or the other, or you may be satisfied with k-means, and Gaussian may be more flexible depending on the geometry problem that you're working with. So the way that these components work is that you essentially are just giving it inputs. And these inputs are describing attributes, and you're then supplying a number of groups or components for it to kind of divide the inputs into, and those become the clusters. So this is an example of unsupervised learning because you're giving it a data set, and then it's looking for some kind of pattern within that data set, as opposed to supervised learning, which is you're giving it a data set to learn from, and then you're making a prediction based on some new data. It's kind of using all of the the data implicitly and searching within that here, as opposed to trying to predict something new. It's not going to predict a new set of points, for example. So the way that this works is that, okay, we have some panels, but now we need to provide these panels as inputs. I can't just do this, so it doesn't know what to do with actual geometry. So I need to somehow, as a designer, figure out what my attributes actually are. I need to cluster and group things based on numerical properties. In this case, I have panels, and there are different ways with which we might classify these panels or quantify them in some way. One example may be something as simple as the area of a panel. An area of the panel might be a way for us to determine likeness between these panels. So if I can go to the Surface tab and find the area component, this is computing the area of each panel. You can see that there is variation in the areas. Another potential property that we may try to harvest are things like perimeter, right? The perimeter length of any given panel may be a quality that we want to differentiate and group based on. So what I'm going to do is then find the edges of each panel. So I'm going to go to the surface here, and here we get the faces. There's our edge collection. And what I'm going to do is join all those edges. Join curves. So now we have a listing of curves there. I'll flatten that as such. And I'm going to get the length of those curves. So those two attributes may be enough for us to get started. Obviously, there's much more than just curve length and area to start to differentiate these panels. You could get into measuring the angle of each kind of corner condition of every panel. For example, you could start to measure just one particular edge length versus other edge lengths and really start to break down a very granular set of criteria to group and cluster based on. In this case, we have two. So the way for us to start to make use of this is to say like, okay, well, I need to combine the areas and lengths as a data set. So what I can do is entwine this data, areas and lengths, which is going to give something that looks like this. So here are all our areas and here are all lengths, and we can then do a flip matrix. So we now have attributes that look like so. You'll see that we have now 2 attributes for every single panel that we're going to study, and we can use this as our input. And our components, if we look under here, we're kind of describing 2 clusters, and there's a seed value. I didn't touch on the seed value before. One of the important things to note about machine learning is you kind of need a numeric value to kind of kick off the algorithm, and a seed value may change the outcome a little bit. You're kind of seeding, like if you've ever used randomization in Grasshopper at all, not duplicate, where's random, there it is. Random is, you need to generate a list of random values, seemingly random values, but in order for a computer to kick off randomization, you need to start from some value to do the mathematical randomization that it's doing. So that's kind of what that's doing there. So what this is producing for us is a list. There's a result of saying it's going through for each of these items that you're supplying. It's telling you whether it's in group 1 or group 2. There's group 1, there's index 0, right? So it's using indices as the driver. So that's actually, number 1 is group 2, from a numerical standpoint, and so on. So what we can do then is start to use these results to color code the panels, or do some sort of sorting of the panels themselves. I'm going to use this as like a way to start to drive color coding. So what I'm going to do here is pull out a gradient tool, and let's see, I'll make this something like so. And the way the gradient tool works is I need to establish my upper and lower bounds. I'm simply going to use the bounds of these values, so it's going to essentially be 0 and 1 because I only have 2 clusters. Let's see here, math. So, and what we see is that, okay, it's between 0 and 1. If I change this to, say, 4, it's saying between 0 and 3, sorry, because there's now 3 groupings of this. And then I'm going to deconstruct this, pass that into L0 and L1, and then that into T. So it's basically going to be taking this as the overall bounds. The result is then going to be mapped along this gradient. So theoretically, each group is now going to get its own color when I override the color property of the panel. So if I go back all the way back here, what I want to do is override the color of my panels. You can see we have a flattened list of panel objects. And what I can do then is go here and find, let's see if there's let's move to display, I believe. It's going to be under custom preview. So here, as you can feed into any geometry out of the box, it's going to kind of give you like a purpley geometry. I'll disable the preview on that, like so. And if I drag this all the way over here and then pass in my color gradient, we'll start to see the outcome of how the algorithm is starting to classify these panels. It's finding that since I'm dividing this up into 4 groups, it's saying that these panels share similar area perimeter properties. These panels share similar area perimeter properties, a couple of green ones in there, red, and so on. So it's generating those groups. I can also do something like the slider. If I want to control the groupings, I'll do something all the way up to 20. So there's 0 groups, 1 group. And you can start to see how increasing the complexity, and at a certain point the algorithm doesn't like to group anymore because it's perhaps not finding any more clusters, or it's too hard to find clusters just given these 2 properties, right? So here you have a 10 clustered set. There are 10 panel types based on these properties. To kind of give an idea of how these 2 algorithms may be a little different from each other, I'll drag that down to 4. What I can do is use the same inputs from the Gaussian for Kmeans, and I'll use the same clustering setup there. And let's see, what can I do here? Okay, you know what I'll do? Just to make it easy to swap between, I'll create a numerical input there. And then I can say, okay, what does the result look like from Kmeans? Kmeans is giving us that type of result. Gaussian is giving us this type of result. So again, algorithm selection becomes really important for being able to determine the differences. So I think the example that I have in our example documents has here's the panelization 1. I think it's almost identical. Yeah, it's kind of the same type of thing. And let's see what attributes I'm actually using. Yeah, I think in this case I'm using, in this case, instead of using the attributes of length or area and perimeter, in this example I'm using the planarity, doing a planarity test as well as the sort of perimeter length test. But I could also go over here and easily extend this scenario to include those other attributes. So if I went over here and I want to make this algorithm smarter and say, this is a pretty dumb algorithm as it is, not too sharp of a learned machine. So I can say to make this thing smarter, I want to introduce another attribute in my grouping. So I'm going to go to LunchBox, and I can use, say, this Flatness Check tool. And what I can do is say, okay, I want to test the flatness of each one. And what this is going to do is it's going to take each of the panels and create a flattened version of that panel. So you can start to see, like in this one, there's like an extreme, here's the original panel, here's the flat version of the panel, and you have this deviation here. And what this is going to give us, it's going to give us the flat panel projections. It's also going to give us the projection planes, but it's also going to give us then this distance of how out of plane the panel is. So this can easily then be used as a way to further help our sorting. So I'm going to go over here where I combined area and length and said, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm now going to pass in my distance, and that is now going to be included as an attribute that it's going to be searching and clustering based on. So, and again, if I want to test what that looks like without flatness, it's giving us this type of result, but because I'm adding a new attribute in, it's giving us a more refined result. So I could really build up a list of attributes that would help with this sorting, right? Other examples. So there are some, these might be fun to take apart in as a matter of personal research. There are some examples here. There's the Gaussian mixture, similar example to what I just showed. Linear regression. There's a logistic regression. The neural network is interesting. When people think machine learning, they get really excited by neural network. It sounds cool. Yeah, I think that's why people get really into it. So neural networks are the example that you find with neural networks are like feature recognition. If you have a picture of a like a number or letter, like the intro tutorial for neural networks, or like training up a neural network to recognize like a certain letter or character, or you can even get to the point of recognizing faces with some really robust versions of some of these things. In this case, let's see if I can get this example to get up and running here. So this case is a neural network that's aimed at predicting what a space should be based on various characteristics that I'm feeding in. So what you have here as training data is you have some training geometry, and what you can see is that there is these are some phone booths. They're smaller, and they've got there's like two versions of it. So this is a size and this is a size. You have a small office, both varying in size a little bit. A medium office, a large office. Again, there's a threshold in size and conference rooms. And what I'm doing is a very similar set of moves when it comes to decomposing that geometry into a set of attributes. You can see that I'm getting the area of every space. I'm getting the length of every space and the width of those spaces. I'm also giving it a name. So each of these has a name that's being labeled accordingly and an index for each of those names. And I'm taking those vectors and saying, okay, with a neural network, you have to, even though these are like 16, 15, 100, whatever, the neural network is expecting values between 0 and 1. So the data needs to be normalized in some way. And when you normalize it, it also can help you start to bias certain features as well. So here it's saying all of those attributes are being treated evenly and being remapped between 0 and 1. And then the neural network here is taking those inputs and taking the labels. So you have the inputs, which are the attributes, and then the labels, which are these indices. It's requiring numeric data, right? So I can't just feed in phone booth and small office. I'm basically saying phone booth, and then I'm giving those special space indices. I'm then saying within the system, I'm now going to give it a new space. So here's my test geometry. And I want to predict, based on the size of this geometry and the overall dimensions of this geometry, what is it? Is it a conference room or is it a phone booth? And so I'm testing it, and it's being passed in, and then the neural network is predicting that it is a conference room. We can test this a little bit and say, let's see how smart this thing really is. I don't think it's going to be too terribly smart. I test this one. So it's kind of within the threshold now of saying, oh, okay, this is a phone booth based on what we know of the geometry. If I extend it out, let's see if I can confuse it. So it has the length of a conference room. So it's saying, yeah, this is most likely a conference room because of those attributes. But maybe if I bring this up, now it's a large office. So it's because it's matching something that's pretty close to one of these in terms of area and overall proportion. And then if I extend it out this way, maybe I can get it to read as a conference room again. Or still a large office. There it is, back to a conference room. Right. So you can almost conceive of like a little planning tool helper, right? with a setup like this. Let's see if I can get the Bayes example going. So this one is the facade type one that I showed earlier. I think I need a supporting and supplemental document. Let's see if this works. It doesn't look promising. Okay, so it referenced everything in. I think it might be looking for a, yeah, okay, I also need to set this up to look for a CSV file. Ah, it's an Excel file. Yeah, Excel file. So this one takes a little bit longer to run, but while it's running, this is the same spreadsheet I showed earlier, right, where you have some hypothetical observable criteria about a given design condition or facade condition, where you have orientation, the size. This is abstracted. And naive Bayes is interesting because you can use text, and it uses text as this kind of way to classify objects. So you're essentially feeding in this table as is. You've got north, small, it's small. So you might have another table that kind of quantifies what does small mean, office and facade type of medium. And that gives you the medium facade performance type. And what this does is it takes this information and says, okay, here's some geometry. This is the data to test. All of these are different geometric scenarios that I'm testing. I'm saying, okay, well, given this observable data, this data that was collected in a hypothetical observation scenario, let's train an algorithm to predict the facade type that needs to be applied, or what the performance characteristics should be of that facade. So the way that this is playing out is that we've got our geometry that's being referenced in. It's then going through a process of determining the programmatic type. So it's like, okay, this is an office building. This is the area of the facade. So it's calculating, computing the area of the facade, but then it's based on the area thresholds in this Python script, it's saying whether or not something is large, medium, or small, right? So it's kind of making some of those assumptions. And it's also then determining the orientation based on like an angle calculation from north. And it's then giving us this organized test data to work with. This is then feeding everything in. Here's your test data. Here's the data table. There's some structural things you need to provide, whether basically the column names essentially. So it's pulling those in separately, orientation, size, program, and all that. And then it's going through a assignment process where it's saying, okay, this is the result. These are what the facade types should be. And I'm over here selecting the facade and coloring it based on what's being selected. So it's the blue ones are lower performing, and the yellow ones are medium, and these are high performing. So based on the orientation, you actually start to see like this algorithm kind of figuring out how these facades should perform. And you can actually kind of, from an intuitive standpoint, because of the way we've trained it and set this up, it's like it kind of has a passing similarity for some type of solar analysis, but it's not doing any form of simulation. It's just using data to kind of predict certain outcomes. And then this part becomes really important because It's giving us probabilities. The important thing to note again about these algorithms is that it's not just, in this case, it's not just one answer. There's this level of certainty about what that answer is. So if I start to look at this, I can say like, okay, well, here's like a little key for this facade here. It's 84% certain that it's going to be a low performing facade, but it's 15% certain it might be medium. So this kind of gives you an indicator of like where you might spend your time as a designer. This one's really ambiguous. 40% to 50, to 60%. Like it might want to be high, it might want to be a low performing facade. And the idea is that these algorithms should expose those types of data points that enable decisions. That's all I had to kind of go through. I wanted to kind of give you some insight into what machine learning is, how it's applied and exposed in LunchBoxML, and some kind of abstract examples of how it may be